Hello. It is October 5th, 2024. It's a very special date for me because it's the date that 15 years ago my father passed into eternal life. He died on October 5th, 2009. And I want to dedicate these short reflections on peace to the memory of my father. My father was a Navy man. He was one of those people who joined the Navy while he was in college during World War II. And he got sent from Notre Dame to Columbia to finish up his college. Notre Dame mailed him his diploma while he was at Columbia. And he was a candidate for officer naval training, and they called them 90-day wonders because they put them through all the training they could do in a very quick way. And he both graduated from Notre Dame and he became the commander of an LCT, and he did receive the Bronze Star Medal for valor in his actions at the Battle of Saipan. Actually, prior to the battle, he made a decision to get the Marines on the beach something they needed that was on his boat, and he got them what they needed, and then he had to pull out of the harbor before the invasion started, and during high tide, and he got the boat out, and the Marines recommended him for the Medal for Valor, and that was accepted by the Defense Department at that time, and I guess in those days they called that the Department of War. James Forrestal signed his citation. He was the Secretary of the Navy at the time, and in those days they sent the citation back to the parents of the person that was in the war zone. And of course my dad had made it seem like he wasn't even in the war zone by leaving a bunch of correspondence that he wrote in Hawaii, and he told a friend of his who was there to keep dropping the letters into the mail. So my grandparents were sitting there in Appleton, Wisconsin, reading this mail about how he was enjoying the golf and how he was enjoying the Hawaiian beauty and all that. And meanwhile, he was in Saipan, and so they were completely surprised when the War Department sent that Bronze Star Medal citation to my grandparents, and showing that my father had shown courage under enemy fire. See, he wanted to spare them the trauma of thinking about their son in the war zone. But there was a deeper thing going on there, and it's worth pondering today, because it is the 15th anniversary of my dad's passing, and I've started to fit things together from history and from my family history that might help us see get some more insight about the problem of war itself. Okay, so it has to be understood that my grandfather was really had trouble actually believing that his son should go to war. And So he was absolutely thrilled that my father had a total deferment from going to a war zone, because his older brother was at the shipyards in Manitowoc, Wisconsin during the war. And he was one of, I guess they said, he was one of 2 people in the whole country that had the plans for the submarines that they were building in Manitowoc during the war. My uncle Art, he was a naval architect. And so Uncle Art got my father a deferment job putting together the inner workings of that submarine. The actual, they called it the Christmas tree board. That's what they called it, because there were a lot of different colored lights on the control panel of the sub. And my dad was so skilled labor and working very, very hard shift work in the Manitowoc shipbuilding company during World War II. And my dad just decided, much to the chagrin of my grandfather, that he was going to enlist anyway. What he told me years later was all his friends from Notre Dame had enlisted. Many of them were in war zones, and he didn't want to miss out, I guess, on the calling that he saw in the lives of his friends. But this created a problem for my grandfather. You see, my grandfather was close friends with Senator Nye. They grew up together in Hortonville, Wisconsin. And of course, Senator Nye ended up in South Dakota, and he became a U.S. Senator there. And during the 1930s, he was in charge of what they called the Nye Committee, where they studied the causes of World War I. And they recognized that there had been kind of some collusion in America that pushed us in the direction of World War I. And so Gerald Nye became a very, very influential, what we call then, the member of the America First movement. And of course, there were other people who leaned in that direction or were members of that movement. Gerald Nye was like the political leader of that movement. Charles Lindbergh was one of the popular leaders of that movement. And it was a movement designed to keep us out of foreign wars, and it was based on their concern about what the Nye Committee had started to uncover. Now, it's kind of an odd thing, but I met Gerald Nye in 1971 when I first visited Washington, D.C., when I was in 7th grade. My first trip to the nation's capital, we're touring all the sites, and my father says, let's go over to Chevy Chase and visit Senator Nye. He's ill, but his mind is good. And we'll talk to him. And I thought, wow, visit a person from history. Well, yeah, Senator Nye was ill. He was in bed. But in fact, he joked about it. He said that he woke up every morning, asked for the newspaper, and he said if his name wasn't in the obituary column, he would keep on living and reading. He was joking about that with us. I remember that. His wife took me down to their basement and showed me all these political cartoons that were written during the time when Nye was fighting very much for the America First movement. Well, the America First movement before World War II was abruptly ended, of course, by the Pearl Harbor debacle. Okay, and I call it the Pearl Harbor debacle because there were many things that got discovered later on about Pearl Harbor, and so that takes us to I believe it was in late fall of 2001. I had read a book by Robert Stinnett called Day of Deceit, about Pearl Harbor. And I was up in Door County visiting my parents, and lo and behold, I tell my dad and my mom the thesis of that book. It was just an interesting historical book that I was reading. But the thesis of the book, Day of Deceit, was that basically that Pearl Harbor wasn't the historical fact that we always thought it was, and that Stinnett is revising history and explaining what, and now you know the rest of the story kind of history. So he's clearing away the kind of myth that and false myth that got built up around Pearl Harbor, and he tells the true story. And the story is basically that the American government did all kinds of things to pull Japan into that war, and I'm not going to. You can go read Stinnett's book, and of course this became a family problem at our dinner table that night at the restaurant. My father got very, very angry at me, and he said, "Don't read books like that." And of course that didn't happen that way. And and everyone in the restaurant heard my dad's outburst, and I was horrified, because my goal in visiting my parents in their elder age was never to disturb them. I mean, I was there to help them, and I didn't want any controversy. And I just innocently stumbled into a discussion about a book, and so of course I quieted down. I didn't say any more about that topic during the dinner. And then, as was custom, it was time to finish dinner. My dad would insist. He was a fairly rotund man. I was talking to someone about this. Not quite as rotund as G.K. Chesterton, but my dad carried weight. And so he would walk slowly. And he never wanted people around him when he was walking. He didn't want people to hover over him. So my mother and I, as was our custom, we walked to the car way ahead of him. And we're sitting in the car waiting for Dad. And I once again apologized to my mother. And she has a smile on her face. And she's I said, "Smile on your face? I mean, and her reaction was, and what she said was very revealing. She said, "Oh, Gus's dad always said things like that." So I had uncovered a family argument where, now of course my grandfather didn't know the details that Robert Stinnett, the military historian, had uncovered, but he had an intuition that there was a real problem with our involvement in that war. And so my mom's smile indicated something. And when she told me that, I was like, huh? But of course, I never brought that up again with my father. It was just not a topic. I didn't want to disturb him. It's like, there was another time. I was in Florida with my parents, and this was earlier on. And well, was it? I can't remember the exact date. No, it was. I'm just thinking of the date. Oh, this is later. So we're down in Florida because my parents moved back and forth between Wisconsin and Florida in those days, and they were down in Florida, and we were out to eat at a restaurant. And the thing that they said at the restaurant on the menu was, "Come to this restaurant, and you won't have to bet the farm and lose your farm over the bill in the restaurant." And I looked at how crowded this restaurant was, and I made a joke. And I said to my parents, and they were, my dad was hard of hearing, so I said it fairly loudly, and it was outdoors in the restaurant. And I said, I said, Dad, look at how crowded this restaurant is. I said, how is it that the people who live here on Sanibel Island, which is where they lived, are so worried about losing their farm that they're all eating here, and they must be all worried about spending too much money on what they're going out to eat on. And I said it loudly, and some people over at the other table looked over to me and said, because my parents were the oldest people in that whole crowded restaurant, and some guy looked at me and he said, "Shh, don't disturb your parents with that kind of information." See, the people there were already getting ready for what they thought would be something of a financial collapse, I think. And I just blurted that out. I wasn't thinking so much about a financial collapse, but I noticed that the people were eating at a place that advertised that you wouldn't have to lose your farm over the price of the meal. Well, we don't have to go into all that happened in 2008 and 2009 to understand that those people understood something that I didn't understand at the time. But even my joking comment pointed to an intuition that they had, or an idea they had, and yet it was all to be left. We don't disturb really elderly people with that kind of discussion. Well, certainly the discussion of war and money is like, it comes under like politics and religion too. It's like certain things you don't talk about if they make people mad in polite company. And of course, since then in America, we're looking at a bigger list of things that you can't talk about easily. And certainly, I have noticed that even people who agree with me on certain topics will not discuss them with me in public. It's kind of interesting. I just wasn't raised that way, as you can already tell. We were raised with lots of freedom of speech in my family, and so, and if it got to the point that Dad didn't like the speech, he did tell me he wasn't going to listen, or he didn't like what I said, but he didn't take away my right to say it. It would be more of a matter of manners or politeness, what I was going to decide to say or not say. Well, now fast forward to 2009, okay? Now, we're getting close to the end. It's of my dad's life. It's either late August or early September of 2009. And it turned out that his caregiver went to Pearl Harbor and talked about, as a tourist, and saw the USS Arizona Memorial and all that, and she was talking about it. And Dad got real quiet, and he looked at me, and he said quietly, this is now 2009, we pulled Japan into that thing, didn't we? And it's like, and of course, the whole point of my relationship with my father at that time was not to win historical arguments with him. I wasn't interested in that. But I had to tell him the truth. I looked at him and I very, very gently said, well, yes, Dad, it seems that the best historians say so. And then he was quiet. I was quiet. We never discussed it again. And of course, he died like 4 or 5 weeks later. It was almost as if he had lived that long in order to come to a revelation about war. And he came to see it from another angle, an angle that he had refused in 2001. But suddenly, just like T.S. Eliot says, old men ought to be explorers. And indeed, he continued to explore the regions of his intuitions, of his experience, and I think to some extent of his own father's wisdom, Gerald Nye's wisdom. And today we are at a crucial turning point, I think. I've heard one journalist say an inflection point when it comes to war in our country, in our culture, in our world. And once again, we ought not to get fooled by the voices that say that there's no other option. Because there is an option. And it seems to me that one of the things that happens is that the lack of good, solid information on what's really happening, which is often held back by certain factions in the world, keeps people from making good decisions about these matters. And the key church teaching that I want to invoke as a religion teacher is this. According to Pacem in Terris, which is the peace encyclical of John the 23rd, people have a right to be truthfully informed about public events. What if the real truth about the machinations that pulled America and Japan into the Pearl Harbor debacle were really known to everybody? Do you think the America First movement would have closed down? I don't think so. And I think that they say that you don't learn from history. Or the only thing I think Hegel said it, the only thing you learn from history is that nobody learns from history. But if human history can be cleared of its dust of usage, says Romano Guardini, then there could be hope that human history could reveal something that will save a lot of lives. And that's where we might differ with Hegel there. So in other words, I'm hoping we can learn from history. That's why I've taken this time on October 15th, 2024, to remember my father, to remember gratefully both his service to the country and the clouds of mystification that surrounded that service. And the discovery he made quite almost right at the end of his life as a man who continued to explore, as a man who knew he was a pilgrim. He became, from being a decorated man of war, he became a man of peace. And he did die peacefully on October 5th, 2009. I was there. I wasn't right with him when he died because he sent me home that night. He didn't want me to be there. He was doing pretty much the same thing he had done with his own parents when he went into the dangerous war zone. Sent me home. And then I got the call from the hospital on the morning of October 5th. And then I went to the hospital and I took care of the phone calling and all the things that happen when someone dies. Did the prayers of the dead over his body. I prayed with his doctor. I prayed with the hospital chaplain. My sister came up from Milwaukee, and we prayed again. And then, the rest, October 5th, it's seared into our memory, our consciousness. But when I step back from it today, I want to remind people not to give in to the forces of falsehood and violence that would tempt us in the wrong direction at this time in history. My father died between the feast of St. Francis. He died at about 4:30 in the morning, 4:20, 4:30 in the morning. And of course, October 4th is the feast of St. Francis. October 5th is the feast of St. Faustina, the person with the devotion to divine mercy. So we have my father kind of suspended between this great saint of peace, Francis of Assisi, and the great saint who gave us the prayers of mercy. I share this with you and ask you to remember his soul in mercy and remember all of us who work for peace. Thank you very much.